I realized that the West, and not just in the UK, but obviously in America with Biden and others, were on the one hand, at one corner of their mouth, they were very keen on human rights and liberty and liberal values and respect and the international rule-based order and so on. But on the other hand, they were at the same time actively funding and sending arms to a government which had explicitly announced its intention to ethnically cleanse or genocide a population. So Netanyahu used various well-known tropes about the Amalek, this is a
Hmm.
biblical reference, which many in the West didn't pick up. Having read the Bible, I realized what he was saying, but and was quite. And I looked in the media, thought, well, are people getting this? What he's saying? And the Times didn't get it. The Guardian really didn't get it. The BBC didn't really notice it. I thought, hang on, are these journalists so ignorant? Don't they realize what's been said here? I'd heard this discourse before about the West being white supremacists, but I never really believed it because I
Right.
didn't consider myself. I mean, I've got friends that they're not racist. Well, what's this white racist thing? But I suddenly understood really what was being said here, and it's not that individual Westerners are somehow crudely racist, although some are, but I don't think most are at all. That's not what I'm saying. It's the sense that the whole civilization is premised on a supremacist understanding of what it is and its role vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And the racial dimension is absolutely there. It's just beneath the surface. It's the veneer may be, we are not racist and we are inclusive, etc. But just beneath the surface, it's there in all its hideous reality. I've seen photographs of Jews and Muslims and Christians living in Palestine at the beginning of the 20th century, or even at the end of the 19th century. And when you look at these Jews living in Palestine, these are Arabs. They look like Arabs. They're not white. They are whatever the cliche is, that they are brown-skinned people. I mean, these are kind of fairly crude characterizations, but they don't look European at all. They look like everyone else. They look like the Christians in Palestine and the Muslims in Palestine. They're basically dressed the same way. They look the same way. They spoke Arabic, which means they were Arabs. And look at the Jewish cabinet today. They all look Europeans. They're all white. Yeah, for me, it wasn't a change in identity. It was seeing Muslims not as my in-group, but as my brothers and sisters, actually, because Islam transcends race, nationality, and so on. And so these are, in a very real, metaphysical, ontological sense, brothers and sisters. It's not just identity. This is a kind of a Western, I don't know, sociological concept, which doesn't take religion very seriously. It kind of ignores religion and just uses this kind of language, but it's much more than identity. It's a profound ontological bond. So, as one hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, upon him be peace, said, when one part of the body suffers, we all suffer. So that the suffering of the Palestinians is something we all, whether we're in Muslims in China or in America or Africa or wherever, we identify with their suffering, with the injustice. It's much deeper than identity politics. It's a profound existential, spiritual identification.
All right. So, Paul, normally we just ask guests to kind of introduce themselves for the audience, whatever you want to highlight in your experience or work, whatever you'd want the audience to know a little bit about you.
Well, that's very kind of you. Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to come on your podcast. It's a great honor, especially considering where you are in Hong Kong. That's very exciting. Um, about 3 years ago, during the COVID lockdown, I bought a new MacBook Pro, and I had a regular office job, and I decided to because it was a very isolating experience here in London, in the
Hmm.
UK. I decided to begin to make some videos as a way of kind of communicating with the wider world, particularly in my areas of interest, which is Christian theology, New Testament studies, and Islam, and so on. So this kind of unthought through, non-planned, kind of spontaneous, organic hobby just kind of mushroomed. And in the weeks and months ahead, it kind of snowballed, and thousands of people subscribed, and so on. And that was the beginning of Blogging Theology, which is the YouTube channel. Um, that I have, and it's now branched into other things like the Blogging Theology Academy and other platforms as well. But it's essentially a platform now, really, because it's evolved. But now where we interview academics and scholars, so that their expertise, their knowledge can be shared with a much wider audience, but particularly in the areas of the Abrahamic faiths, but also understood in a very wide sense. So I include politics and international relations and philosophy and history and so on, as well as obscure things like textual criticism and things like that. So it's a very eclectic and broad vision of basically what I find interesting, to be honest. But it's evolved into something now. It's more than just my plaything, so I have to be more responsible because of there's nearly 500,000 subscribers now, and I've met some amazing scholars and academics. So I'm hugely privileged to do what I do. I'm very grateful to do it. So that, in a very simple nutshell, is the story.
Perfect, perfect. That's kind
Hmm.
of a little bit of your story is very interesting to I think both of us, but maybe particularly me because I was raised in a very right-wing religious household, and then in my later teenage years, I kind of developed out of that and
Hmm.
complete
Hmm.
my whole worldview kind of fell apart, and I had to rebuild it. So that inspired in
Hmm.
me an abiding interest in why people believe what they believe, and more particularly, like how people go from being very staunch believers in X and
Hmm.
then through
Hmm.
some sort of process end up believing in something quite contrary to X. Now,
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
have like a Zoroastrian friend who one time asked me, there was something in the news, and she asked like, Peter, what's the difference between the Abrahamic religions again? I keep getting them confused. So she might say that it's not that big of a switch to go from Christianity to Islam. But do you have any thoughts from your experience on, that process of at some point realizing that what one had believed wasn't true, and then deciding to try to rebuild one's view of the world from scratch? Is that, what you would describe your experience as, or
No,
what was your experience?
not as dramatic perhaps as yours. Mine was a slower, more incremental, more organic process. So in my early teens, I became a Christian, an evangelical Christian in a Baptist church here in London. So before that, I'd been very secular, hadn't been religious. I was just going with the flow, hedonistic, and so on as a teenager. But then I became a Christian, as I said, and that was the first big paradigm shift. So I entered into, as I saw it, a moral universe where I had objective points of reference. I believed in God and the Bible and Jesus, and in a very conservative evangelical way. And I think there's a lot of good in that. I still don't look back on that and see it as a mistake. I think though, as a staging post on the way, it had a lot of benefits. But there are negative sides to it as well. But ultimately, some time later, particularly after university, when I studied theology and philosophy, I came to and my discovery of Islam, I came to move to an Islamic understanding of the universe, which contains many commonalities and continuities, as well as discontinuities and differences. And the differences are not just theological, but they're also civilizational for me. It's not like just moving from one little worldview to another little worldview. It really was an existential transformation because being a Muslim, particularly if you're a white English guy, you cross various kind of invisible lines. And it's much more than just a change of theology or kind of mental furniture. It's much more profound than that.
Yeah, sorry, Kareem, I just have one quick follow-up.
Sure.
On that point precisely, I think that's like one of the major impediments that people face is the fact that if they change their worldview, whether it be religiously or politically, they might face the loss of their
Yeah,
closest companions, their family, their
yeah,
friends
that's right.
might reject them. So how did you deal with that, or is that something that you didn't feel was an impediment for you?
No, I did lose. My closest friend at that time, also called Paul, was like me, a very committed Christian. He was a head teacher in a London school. Done postgraduate research at King's College in London. Very bright guy, very passionate about his faith, and we were very close. We both shared a common worldview. And when I became a Muslim, he never spoke to me again. It wasn't like he, it was like he just never respect. It was like I ceased to exist, and it was quite that was quite painful because I didn't expect such an abrupt termination of our friendship. But having said that, I was very blessed and I made many new friends, Muslim friends, of course. So what I lost, I also gained. But yes, I didn't tell my family immediately anyway, because I thought that that's a huge hill. I'm going to climb at a later date. I did in the end, but I kind of did it slowly with different people, friends, work colleagues. And mostly it was positive, but there were one or two people who were not happy at all, to put it mildly. So no, this is normal.
Mm.
Wow, yeah, that sounds like a very interesting process. And I saw one of your latest videos. And now the what was the title again? How I changed my mind on Palestine, something like that, if I
Yeah,
remember.
yeah, 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 that's right. Yeah,
Yeah, or
yeah,
why I changed my mind on Palestine.
yeah.
And that was really, really such an amazing monologue, and I share that with a lot of people around me. I think that is for a lot of people so important to understand
Mm,
that shift from a more of a propagandized perspective that we all had in the West towards
mm,
a new, you can almost say, understanding of the imperialism behind the whole issue in Palestine, the genocide in Palestine.
yeah, yeah.
And you mentioned in that video, and I will put the link below for our viewers to go to your channel.
Yeah.
You mentioned that you went to three distinct stages in understanding the Palestinian struggle. You
Mm,
said at first you were a Christian with relatively little awareness, then as a new Muslim seeing the world from the oppressed perspective, and finally around a year ago you said you realized how important Western supremacism and racism is also to understand this
yeah.
the whole issue in Palestine. And can
Mm,
you
mm,
elaborate a bit on each of those three stages and what
mm.
specific events or realizations triggered your evolving perspective in each
Mm.
phase?
Yes. So, as I've already said, actually, I became a Christian in my early 20s, actually, and Palestine, Israel couldn't have been further from my consciousness. Really, I was very much preoccupied in my own little world. Um, with it, but nevertheless, in becoming a conservative Christian, one becomes part of a much wider religious movement in the West, and it's global, of course, which typically has a default position, which is pro Zionism, pro-Israel, and also quite Islamophobic. And those two really went together, particularly the Islamophobic perspective, which was something I acquired an increasingly deep way. Actually, I became increasingly Islamophobic. So I think if I ever in the media was aware of what was going on in the Middle East, it would have certainly been seen through that prism of Islamophobia and the Christian pro-Zionist perspective. But I wasn't. I had very little awareness of it, except what one saw in the news, perhaps every now and then. Certainly no systematic engagement with the issues, historical or the nature of Zionism, the history of Zionism, the occupation of Palestine by Zionists. All of that was not really something of interest to me at all. I was very much fixated on the Bible and Christianity and things like that.
Mhm.
But then, obviously, I did embrace Islam sometime later, and that was the first stage in the change in perspective. It wasn't so much on Palestine, but it was this shift from an uncritical default position where I, as a white Christian in the West, saw the world in the ways are characterized, to seeing the whole global situation from the position of the Ummah, the Muslim Ummah. This is the kind of the global Muslim community. And that inevitably meant I started to see things differently and pick up those concerns and issues which were central to Muslims, passionate concern. Palestine being one of them, of course, not just Palestine, but that is a key, absolutely central thing. So suddenly I became aware of that, and so I became, I read Ilan Pappé's book on the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, which was a formative moment in my consciousness of what was happening there. Um, And so my awareness really was historical. There was no passionate contemporary issues at that time. There's the ongoing ethnic cleansing, but it hadn't reached the catastrophic proportions that we've seen in the last 12 months, I don't think. So it was still an important issue, but not, it didn't really change anything else terribly. In terms of my perception of the West, I simply switched perspectives. So, and then a year ago, after the October 7th attack and the West's response to that, and I remember a key moment when Labour hadn't come to power in Britain at that point. So the Labour Party came to power quite recently in government in the UK. So it was a Conservative government. But I remember the official Labour Foreign Secretary or Foreign the official foreign policy foreign secretary spokesman for the Labour Party being interviewed on television, and so she's a humanist. She supports human rights and the struggle of people, and she's a social democrat slash socialist. And she was asked point blank if she about the Israeli government's explicit position that they were going to cut off water and food and other supplies from the Palestinians in Gaza. And her response was very clear and very shocking. And it was a very mechanical, rehearsed response. I believe in the absolute right of Israel to protect itself and, Israel secure, all this kind of mechanical. And she'd been asked to condemn or comment on an actual genocidal policy of actual starving a whole, people, and this response was quite extraordinary, and it was a common response from many politicians as well. And at that point, I realized something was profoundly wrong, and that was the beginning of the third stage, if you like, where I realized that the West, and not just in the UK, but obviously in America with Biden and others, were on the one hand, at one corner of their mouth, they were very keen on human rights and liberty and liberal values and respect and the international rule-based order and so on. But on the other hand, they were at the same time actively funding and sending arms to a government which had explicitly announced its intention to ethnically cleanse or genocide a population. So Netanyahu used various well-known tropes about the Amalek, this is a biblical reference, which many in the West didn't pick up. Having read the Bible, I realized what he was saying, but and I looked in the media, thought, well, are people getting this, what he's saying? And the Times didn't get it, the Guardian really didn't get it, the BBC didn't really notice it. I thought, hang on, are these journalists so ignorant? Don't they realize what's been said here? Are they not educated on the Bible? So again, every day I would wrestle with these issues, and it became more and more shocking, alarming, as we all have experienced this. And anyway, so that in a very kind of simple way, it is some of the characteristics of my evolving experience of this. But it involved. But another thing I realized, and this was a first for me, and I came late to this realization. Many people, I'm sure you too, you do way before me, is the implicit racism in the West. And this was something that I'd heard this discourse before about the West being white supremacists, but I never really believed it because I didn't consider myself. I mean, I've got friends that they're not racist. Well, what's this white racist thing? But I suddenly understood really what was being said here. And it's not that individual Westerners are somehow crudely racist, although some are, but I don't think most are at all. That's not what I'm saying. It's the sense that the whole civilization is premised on a supremacist understanding of what it is and its role vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And the racial dimension is absolutely there. It's just beneath the surface. It's the veneer may be, we are not racist and we are inclusive, etc. But just beneath the surface, it's there in all its hideous reality. And it's that I realized big time. It was so obvious in the way that we responded to the Ukrainians, for example, and their plight, the way we welcome Ukrainians because they're like us. But when it came to the Syrian refugees, we had a direct role in creating these refugees by arming the opposition to Assad, etc. Long story. We didn't want them here. No, they have to go through the normal process, and it's difficult to get visas, difficult to come in as refugees and all that. A very clear two-tier system, and this was based on based on well, the Ukrainians, even though they're not British at all, are at least white. That was the subtext, and sometimes the explicit text. But the Syrians and others are Muslims, they're brown, they're Arabs, whatever, and therefore we don't really want to engage with them or have them here. And this is very clear, and everyone can see that really. But this goes against the way the West projects its own image of itself, the way it presents how it pretends to be colorblind or objective or welcoming on the basis of merit, but the reality is different.
Exactly, exactly. And we actually had this conversation yesterday as well with another guest, and I talked about this. I've had these discussions with my mother, for example. So I'm half Dutch, half Algerian. My mother is a white Dutch woman, and she also just didn't see these things. And I, from a young age, would tell her, "Mom, that's racism. That's racism." And I would always hear from many people, including my mother, "Stop seeing racism in everything. You know, people are not racist, and our country is not racist." But if you are on the other side, so to speak, whether you're a mixed kid like me with an Arabic name, or in your case, Paul, you become a Muslim, then suddenly you start to see the world through a very different lens. Do I see that correctly?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I sympathize with your mother. I think the way I used to experience it, one constantly hears, I mean, this is how I saw it, not how I see it now. One constantly heard the left shouting slogans, the West is racist, white supremacist, and so on. And it was like an external kind of attack on one's identity or one's sense of being European or whatever. And it didn't connect. It just seemed like a rant that didn't penetrate into one's consciousness. That's how I would put it. It doesn't mean it wasn't true, but I'm just saying that that's how it felt. So a lot of people, white British people, Europeans, they hear the rhetoric, but they don't understand it, and they just don't get it really. But some of us do finally get it, and it takes a genocide to wake us up, or the response to the genocide to wake us up. But yes, it's that deeply ingrained that it takes a paradigm shift to see what is obvious actually to everyone else.
Yeah, and that also explains. Sorry, Peter, just one small comment. That I think also, Paul, explains the anger that you often see among many white Westerners when you start talking about racism or white supremacy. It's really, really the amount of rage I sometimes get
defensiveness.
emailed.
People feel attacked. They get very defensive. The shields go up. We're going to push back on this criticism. I mean, you see this whenever, say, Winston Churchill, who is regularly voted the most amazing, wonderful British leader ever in the history of whatever. And he was a war criminal. I mean, and that's not a slur. It's just he actually directed the use of chemical weapons against the Kurds in Iraq. I mean, the historical record's there. No one disagrees that. No one says it didn't happen. But he actually used chemical weapons to attack civilians explicitly, intentionally, because he wanted to achieve a certain objective. And that's just one of a number of things one could say about him. So, he's a complex character. It doesn't mean that, he's an evil human being. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that to criticize him is taboo very often, but the facts are the facts. And if we can't handle complexity or nuance, or the fact that people are good and bad, because a lot of us are, we are a mixture of things, but we can't speak of that kind of complexity when it comes to our heroes, and we get very defensive. And I guess ultimately it's human nature, I suppose. It doesn't make it right, but I think it's an element of just the way people are, really.
Yeah, there's powerful psychological reasons why it's tough to change people's minds, and when they're raised to believe that Churchill or whoever else was a great hero, and they can think of all of the things that they were told about him that were good, and they never really learned any of the much larger, darker side of him or any other figure. it
Mhm.
causes cognitive dissonance, this
Yeah.
uncomfortable feeling of, wait, no, that can't be true. I have to argue against it. There must be something wrong. I think
Mhm.
also when you were talking about your experience, your reaction to charges from the left of racism in Britain, another issue is that racism has so many different definitions. And I think a lot of times people are talking past each other because conservatives, I would imagine it would be the same in Britain as well as the US. Conservatives tend to think of racism in this very limited way, as if
Mhm.
the only thing that racism is the conscious belief that,
Yeah.
first of all, races exist, and that's a sensible category, which of course it isn't. But then, furthermore, that some quote unquote races are superior to another. And if you don't have that conscious belief, then you
Yeah.
can't possibly be racist. And so they're not really hearing. They've never been taught, for instance, what structural racism is, how
Mm.
disparate outcomes in a system that are disparate on the basis of skin color make
Mm.
the system structurally racist regardless of the ideas in people's heads. But
Mhm.
at any rate, that just called to mind that
Yeah.
observation. I really wanted
Mm.
to ask you, for viewers that they have friends or family who wherever they're living in the world, they're hearing the dominant narrative that's quite similar to the dominant US government narrative or Israeli government narrative or UK government narrative, and they believe it, and they're trying to educate friends and family and get them to see the missing side of the picture that they haven't really encountered. Do you think there's anything from your experience that would be helpful for those types of people with friends or family or colleagues or whatever that they're trying to educate, but they're encountering resistance?
Yeah, it's a huge question. I think there's simply a lack of awareness or ignorance, to be honest, about fundamental historical facts, which people are not often aware of because they're not spoken of. This word Nakba, we talk about the Holocaust and remember the Holocaust, and rightly so, the terrible events happened, but the Nakba is never mentioned in mainstream media, really. And yet, what is this Nakba? This is the systematic expulsion of nearly a million Arab Palestinians from their homes in 1948, 1949, I forget the exact year. Um, and this is a well chronicled event. And this catastrophe, which is what it means, I think, in Arabic, is an absolutely foundational moment when Zionism became a political reality with the state of Israel and systematically ethnically cleansed numerous villages, expel huge numbers of Palestinians from their homeland, and they were forced into what became Jordan and Lebanon, Syria, etc., all over the place. And the West is not, we don't talk about this deliberately, I think. So it's just to, introduce people to what happened in history, to speak about occupation, you use that word, occupation. So the West Bank is occupied, and the fact that this is not known. The Western position in support of Israel is a minority position globally. Most countries recognize Palestine. Most countries condemn the occupation. Most countries do not support this narrative that the minority of countries, Britain and the EU mainly, still maintain. Now, it matters because the West is dominant, but it is a minority of people. Most people on the planet, China, elsewhere, speak up. I noticed the Chinese ambassador to the UN recently, a few days ago, when the Israeli government, the Israeli parliament passed a law saying we would no longer allow United Nations Palestinian, relief agency to provide any food for the Palestinians. That's basically ensuring that they will be starved to death. And the Chinese guy was very clear that this is absolutely appalling and very good. This is typical of most of the world. It's the West that denies this reality. That's the problem. Most people get it actually. So we can remind them of occupation, dispossession, the fact that virtually everyone on the planet recognizes this is illegal under international law, and so on and so on and so on. And also, and this is where it gets controversial from a Western point of view, not controversial from anywhere else. And this is not just controversial; it's actually criminal for me to say this. So I'm having to be very careful in my language that people who are living under military occupation have the right under international law to resist that
Mhm.
occupation. and not just
Yeah.
by writing letters to their MP or their senator, but
Yeah.
actually struggling against it. And and it's extraordinary in the West that this is it's criminalized. You can't actually say this, and this is not hyperbole. It is the case. So I can't say as this about a specific group of Palestinians, we should support their struggle. We're not allowed to say that. But we can point these things out that people do have a right to resist occupation and oppression and ethnic cleansing. And this is common sense. It's not some kind of obscure ideology. But in fact, this is criminalized by the West. But this is a minority position. Most countries in the world acknowledge the right of the Palestinians to self-determination, to a state, to resist the incredible atrocities being perpetuated against them. And so I'm just trying to stress the majoritarian normativeness of this position. Which one doesn't get that impression from the Western media? They portray their position somehow, the default position, but it's not. This is only a small group within the global community. So that's how I would frame it. But whether or not anyone's willing to listen to that, I don't know.
Yeah, and it's again, Paul, that brings us also again to that kind of racialized dichotomy, you could say, because violent resistance coming
Yes.
from historical white populations, such as during the Second World War, or of course Ukraine, is heavily celebrated. But
Yes.
somehow violent resistance from colonized peoples that are, of course, not classified as white, is often immediately rejected or even deemed terrorism.
Yes.
And that brings me also to a question that I have for you and that I actually ask all our guests. And that is the following. In your opinion, what would explain the West's absolute support for this utter barbarity that we are seeing being committed against the Palestinians? I mean, we are now more than a year into a genocide, a blatant genocide. We can see the most horrible images on our phones. And yet the West is so obsessively supportive of Israel and its genocide that in many Western countries are even beating up their own population, you could say, young kids who are protesting to still support Israel. It's for me unfathomable support of such a evil government and evil how can you say that, such well, let's just put it simply, such evil in general. And you said something very interesting that I think may actually play a role. You said that we've asked this question to a lot of our guests, and many say, okay, this is imperial strategy, it's guilt, all these kind of stuff for the Second World War, which I personally do not believe. But you say something that actually very few have said, and you said that the West also sees this conflict along racial lines. So for example, that Palestinians or Muslims, I should say in general, see this conflict more around religious lines, but that many Western societies actually see the Israel-Palestine, well, I hate to call it conflict, because I just see it as pure colonization, but that they see it along racial lines, and that actually may be a big factor in explaining why this persistent support is going on. What is your opinion on this, Paul?
This is a huge question. I'm not an expert on this, so I just want to quote a few sentences from the book by the English writer Guy Eaton, who wrote this marvelous book, Islam and the Destiny of Man. It's one of the greatest books I've ever read in the English language about Islam. And he was a British diplomat, as well as a Muslim convert. And he said, Muslims do not in general share the Occidental obsession with race, Occidental obviously meaning the Western white obsession. Europeans and their American cousins, even when they are quite free from any hostile prejudice, automatically identify people in terms of their racial origin. The Muslim, on the other hand, identifies and judges a man or woman primarily in terms of their religion. A Jew is a faithful adherent of Judaism, just as a Muslim is an adherent of Islam, even if his grandfather happened to be a Jewish rabbi. And then he mentions the famous scholar Muhammad Assad, who was actually a Jewish European convert. And what the West, and he goes on, what the West sees in Israel is the establishment of a homeland for the Jewish race, okay, because of the guilt over the Holocaust. just recompense for centuries of persecution at the hands of Europeans. Whether or not the citizens of the new state happen to be individually religious seems quite irrelevant. What the Muslim sees in Israel is European and American settlers established in a Muslim country with the support of the former imperial powers and maintained there by American arms. And I go on, I'm not going to, just one final thing. Many Muslims are convinced that the Western support for Israel can be ascribed quite simply to hypocrisy. They believe that Europe and the United States created Israel as a means of ridding themselves of their Jewish populations. Now, he goes on to discuss this apparently absurd accusation. But then he goes to talk about how Zionism arose as a reaction to anti-Semitism. And in the view of its founders, people like Theodor Herzl needed anti-Semitism in a sense to define Jews clearly over against their Gentile compatriots, say in Germany or France or whatever. And it's interesting, the Balfour Declaration in 1917, which obviously you know about, but there was a Jewish member of the cabinet. So this was the 1917 declaration that, the Jews should have a homeland in Palestine. But there was one man in the British cabinet that issued this statement, a Jew, actually, by the name of Edwin Montagu. He was the only Jewish member of the British cabinet. And he wrote in a cabinet memorandum about the Balfour Declaration: the policy of His Majesty's government is anti-Semitic in result and will prove a rallying ground for anti-Semites in every country of the world. And interestingly, the British Board of Deputies, which still exists, they also reacted in a letter to the Times in 1917. I'm quoting them here. So this is the official representatives of Jews in Britain in 1917. And this is what they said to the Balfour Declaration: the establishment of a Jewish nationality in Palestine, founded on this theory of homelessness, must have the effect throughout the world of stamping the Jews as strangers in their native lands and of undermining their hard-won position as citizens and nationals of these lands. Now, I think that's so. Jews at that time were not Zionists. It was a minority position. Most Jews were anti-Zionist because it singled out Jews as distinct from their fellow Frenchmen, fellow Germans, fellow Americans, fellow British people, as a unique race, and it was a way of getting rid of them. It was seen by many anti-Semites who supported the Balfour Declaration. Well, great, we can get rid of the Jews from Europe and put them in the Middle East. So it was seen as an anti-Semitic strategy, actually, because it singled them out and problematized them. They weren't really Germans or French or British. They were Jews, and so let's invite them to go and live somewhere else. So I just want to throw that in because how our perspectives have changed in the last years, and there's been this big change from seeing it as very problematic, as Zionism as very problematic and feeding off anti-Semitic tropes, to now being seen as the very definition of what it is to be supporting Jews at all. So the Jewish hostility to Zionism is very powerful at the beginning.
Yeah, but I think there's another change that happened as well. While in those days, I would say, sure, what explains some of the what explains some of the Western support for a Jewish state back in the day was, of course, driven by a lot of anti-Semitism. But I think today something changed. I think today the support transformed into a kind of kinship, and the idea that the Zionist state is a European beacon in a sea of Arab barbarism, so to speak. That's the way they see it. These are not my words. And an example is, and I think you also said that in your monologue, I'm not sure. An example is something that I've also always said is the idea that the fact that Israel is part of the Eurovision Song Festival, for example, or part of the European Championships with football. It's ridiculous, and it shows this kind of actually hypocritical almost insidious kind of racial perception
Well,
of Israel.
this is very interesting. You mentioned the Eurovision Song Contest. This is a trivial cultural example, but it speaks to something deeper. So I've seen photographs of Jews and Muslims and Christians living in Palestine at the beginning of the 20th century, or even at the end of the 19th century. And when you look at these Jews living in Palestine, these are Arabs. They look like Arabs. They're not white. They are whatever the cliche is, that they are brown-skinned people. I mean, these are kind of fairly crude characterizations, but they don't look European at all. They look like everyone else. They look like the Christians in Palestine and the Muslims in Palestine. They're basically dressed the same way. They look the same way. They spoke Arabic, which means they were Arabs. Um, and look at the Jewish cabinet today. They all look Europeans. They're all white. They dress in suits. They look, I mean, if you didn't know and you walked down the street, you saw them in London, they thought, oh, an English person or European. You had no idea that they were from the Middle East, say. So this is a really strange shift from an ethnically indigenous uh, people there who spoke Arabic, who looked like Arabs, behaved like Arabs, to what look remarkably like Europeans now, who talk like Europeans, dress like Europeans, and in terms of their political outlook and their values, very much identify with the West. So this is even 100 years, you've gone from that, which is clearly other from a white Western point of view. These are Arabs, Jews, to oh, these people are just like us, like the Ukrainians. They are indistinguishable. They have the same values. So there's been this, it's extraordinary. I mean, some people say, are these even Jews? Because are they just Europeans, really, who are living in the Middle East, in the Arab world, in the Muslim world, and just colonizing it? Yeah, they call themselves Jewish, but do they even practice Judaism? Because for Muslims, a Jew is someone who is of the Jewish faith, who follows the law of Moses. Israel's a secular state. It doesn't even pretend to follow the Torah at all. So there's been this kind of transformation from what I was saying 100 years ago to now in many levels, religiously, ethnically, the way they're dressed, their appearance, the values, and their lack of religious adherence as well. We're doing something quite different, I think, and it looks like a European or Western secular settler colonization. It looks like Westerners going there under so-called right of return and living in Muslim Palestinian. I should say Muslim because the number of Palestinians are Christians, of course, living in Palestinian lands. It looks like colonialism, really to many of us. It really had nothing to do with Judaism or people going back to their homeland who used to live there. Well, not really. I mean, these people hadn't been there before. I mean, anyway.
Yeah. Thank you for that answer, Peter.
Yeah, I'm looking at the time and I'm worrying that the question I want to ask is quite long, but I'll try to squeeze it down. I'm still trying to get at, how other people who might be watching this could learn from your experience to better or more effectively educate people in their community, people that they know. And when you were talking about your experience, it seemed like it was during the transition to becoming religiously Muslim that you gained exposure to all of these perspectives that previously you might have been aware that they existed, but you hadn't really delved into them. So you didn't really understand them the same way you would if you actually, read a lot about them. And it's bringing back like a couple weeks ago in class, we read this book in political science that is one of the few political science books I would actually recommend. It's pretty good because they're starting to borrow from social psychology and trying to include that in their view of politics rather than previously borrowing from economics, which was a big mistake. But the mistake I see them making is they make too much of identity. They think it's this kind of they treat it as if it's this magical entity that just shapes people's beliefs completely, when it really isn't that. It's much more of a thing that affects the information you get and affects how you process the information you get. you became Muslim, and then in that process of identity shift, you were exposed to information you had never encountered before. And then when you're processing it, you're going to process it differently because you see, a different group as your new in group. So I'm trying to ask, is there anything that you can think of to help people educate people, to help people, propagandize in the non-pejorative sense, to propagate, spread ideas, to educate from your experience that doesn't require that enormous step of a change in identity? Because that seems to me like something too much to ask people to try to do, whereas educating them on this issue or other issues seems at least relatively more tractable. Is there anything that you can think that might be useful for people who are faced with that challenge?
That's a good question. I mean, yeah, for me, it wasn't a change in identity. It was seeing Muslims not as my in-group, but as my brothers and sisters, actually, because Islam transcends race, nationality, and so on. And so these are in a very real, metaphysical, ontological sense, brothers and sisters. It's not just identity. This is a kind of a Western, I don't know, sociological concept, which doesn't take religion very seriously. It kind of ignores religion and just uses this kind of language, but it's much more than identity. It's a profound ontological bond. So, as one hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, upon him be peace, said, when one part of the body suffers, we all suffer. So that the suffering of the Palestinians is something we all, whether we're in Muslims in China or in America or Africa or wherever, we identify with their suffering, with the injustice. It's much deeper than identity politics. It's a profound existential, spiritual identification, and nothing will beat that. You're asking how can people have that change without that, a similar change in understanding without that transformation.
Mm.
Is more difficult. And I think for me, one of the biggest issues here is the historic civilizational clash between the West, the Christian West, and the Muslim world. This lies beneath the surface, I think. So the Israelis now are basically like us. They're white, they're Western, they look like us, they talk like us, they say their values are the same as us, as Westerners. And they are they're colonizing Palestine, but hey, we colonized North America, and but their enemies are the Muslims. So this is the cliche, and of course Muslims aren't like us. They're kind of the other. They're brown. They have different values allegedly, although that's hugely exaggerated. And so there is this deeper civilizational issue that's triggering tropes that go back centuries about the Muslim other. We can relate to the Israelis because they're basically Europeans or like Americans, but these Palestinians often are speaking a language that but when we in the West, when Allah Akbar or the words like jihad or other expressions are so twisted and stigmatized that they're no longer able to be uttered except as quasi-terrorist kind of slogans. But that's not what they mean. They are a dispossessed people struggling against occupation. So I think this is very deep, and I don't have an easy answer. We can just chip, I don't know, maybe we can chip away at it by talking about occupation, talking about the Nakba, talking about reframing it as settler colonization rather than just whatever. But I think the problem is so deep, it does take a quasi-religious conversion or an actual religious conversion to cross this civilizational line. It is that deep. It's not just a question of, oh, if only they understood this thing or that thing, or it's a whole, as the Germans call them, Weltanschauung. It's this whole kind of worldview.
So
And
would
that's
you say also for the younger generation who seems to be really aware, I must say, when it comes to
yes.
this?
That's the different. No, this may be, in fact, that may be the seeds of the answer. But perhaps, yes, maybe you've hinted at the answer. So, I've seen that you have, girls in Wyoming or small towns in America on TikTok, getting it. They've seen the genocide, they've seen the appalling photographs, what's happening in Palestine, and they get it, and they're becoming aware. So they haven't had to go through this religious conversion. They just have to see what's going on. And this is the first time in history this has ever happened because of social media. So maybe the salvation in this way will come through awareness through social media, not through religious conversion. But I think both are parallel ways of affecting change. But particularly for young people, they're not buying they no longer believe in the mainstream media. They no longer believe what the government's telling them, because they can see with their own eyes the utter devastation that their own tax dollars are, funding in Palestine. So yeah, I think that might be a very powerful way of changing things. So
Well,
you've
I
got to
think
go.
Sorry, guys, I've got to
Yeah.
that,
run. But
Okay.
thank you so much, Paul. It was great talking with you,
Yeah.
and I hope to do it again
Pleasure.
sometime.
Sure.
okay,
Okay.
see you, Peter. I'm going to ask you one more final question, if I'm allowed,
Oh, I see.
Paul.
Of course.
So I am always very interested in people's lenses through the world, and your change from a Christian person to a Muslim changed the way you perceive the world, but probably also the way you experience the world. And my question is a bit of a broad question, but as a European white Muslim, how do you think, what makes your experience as a white Muslim, you think, unique compared to Muslims of color? And then I mainly mean Muslims in the West. And in particular, what do you think makes it easier, and are there also aspects that actually make it more difficult?
Well, it makes it easier in that I'm seen as an eccentric, I guess. Here's Paul, a white middle class Englishman who became a Muslim. How curious, how interesting, how eccentric, or oh, poor guy, he's fallen for that or whatever. Um,
Mhm.
but that is much more benign than my fellow Muslim brothers and sisters who are not from that demographic background, who experience I know it's all very cliche, but it's profoundly true. Racism, discrimination, stigmatization, they're treated differently. And the thing that really brought it home for me a couple of years ago, when in the last couple of years, I've been traveling abroad quite an awful lot, and sometimes I go with other people to conferences and whatnot around the world. And is the experience of going through airports, going through immigration, security, passport control, that kind of thing. And I'll just give you one example. So, beginning of last year, I went to San Francisco to visit Zaytuna College there, and and I knew what would happen, and it did happen. That I go to passport control, and I knew the whole process of me going through immigration would take about 3 seconds. I mean, really, I knew exactly what they're going to ask me, purpose of visit, how long are you going to stay? I said, blah, 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 boom, I'm through. Always the case. I mean, I don't know why they even bother interviewing me. It's just like, boom, straightforward, formality, not interested, on your thing. I also know, because the people I'm with, this is not the experience of other Muslims who are not white. You have a name like Mohammed or something. Absolutely not their experience. I know one guy who's an executive in Microsoft. He's based in London. So he travels first class to California a lot. He's been doing it for years. And always he gets stopped and they ask him questions about, and it takes a long time. He's used to it. It's part of the normal routine of traveling. Now, when I discovered this difference, the people I knew, people I was traveling with, it was really shocking because these weren't suspects. I mean, these are just regular people, business people, academics, students, whatnot. And they're routinely treated differently and this is not just in the West, in Muslim countries, they're like in Egypt, that they have the same attitude. Um,
Right.
Really quite bizarre, So you have like non-whites doing the same thing to non-whites, this thing about who are you? Why are you coming here? Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so it's kind of pretty universal, actually. And so as Muslims, their experience of international travel is very, very different from mine. I have, and so now I have white privilege. It really exists, and I know that not because I've read a left-wing book or I've fallen victim to some left-wing propaganda that I heard at a rally. No, I know this for a fact because I've lived through it over and over and over again, countless times. I have empirical evidence. And I've learned that everyone else has always known this. It's just me, because I didn't used to travel much until a couple of years ago. I didn't realize this was a thing even. So, such as my lack of awareness So that's just one little microcosm, an example of how I became aware of the differences, how Muslims are treated depending on their ethnic origin. And I say it's not just with the West that does this. Many Muslim countries also do the same thing, bizarrely.
Yeah.
There are other reasons why they do it, but we won't go into. But so most places are doing it actually, and it's annoying because the West presents itself as very civilized and non-racist and inclusive and all this stuff. And I'm sure many of them might even believe it, but that's not what happens. And this is not conspiracy theory. It's just brutal, everyday fact that everyone knows.
Yeah, absolutely, and very, very good example also. And it would be, I think even changing maybe your attire or your first name would already make a tremendous difference in what would happen, even when you travel. I think, let alone, of course, if you're a person, a brown person or a black person. But that these were all very, very interesting questions, and I always have many more to ask, but we are at the hour right now, so I'm gonna leave it here. And I can really, really advise people who are now watching to go to your channel, Blogging Theology. And very, very good stuff. Good talks as well. People who want to know more about religion, and also just like the last monologue about your change in your views on Palestine. I think everybody should watch that. So again, I'm gonna put the link in the description. But anyway, Paul, thank you so much for coming on. That was
Thank you,
great.
Kareem, for the invite. It's been great fun. I appreciate your questions, and I hope something of what I've said might be of some use. But it's a very difficult subject, and I don't think there are any easy answers. So I'm aware of how fraught and complicated and stressful this whole thing is, and it's not easy.
Absolutely, absolutely, especially in these days. But the good thing is that we are starting to talk about it amongst each other. So that's a very, very positive development in these dark times, I must say. And I'm gonna keep an eye on your channel, and maybe one day you have another superb monologue, and we're gonna invite you again. I hope that's fine.
No, thank you very much for your time, Kareem, and your colleague as well. It's been good fun. Thank you.
All right.
Take
Have
care.
a good day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.